On the eve of battle, a battalion of soldiers marched forward and vanished. No bodies, no graves, no witnesses. Only silence where hundreds of men should have stood. Most who watch haven't subscribed. If you believe these stories of war should never be forgotten, subscribe now. Because what happened that night remains one of history's darkest mysteries. A battalion swallowed before the fighting even began. The question is, who or what took them? The fog clung to the earth like a living thing. It rolled through the valleys of Macedonia in October 1915, curling around rocks, swallowing trees, muffling the crunch of boots on gravel. For the French soldiers advancing through it, every step felt like a step into nothingness. The men of the 57th French Colonial Infantry Battalion were not raw recruits. They had seen service in Africa, in France, and on other forgotten fronts of the Great War. Hardened by campaigns, armed with Liebel rifles, steel helmets pressed low over their brows, they marched in disciplined silence. Their orders were simple: link up with Serbian forces still resisting the Bulgarians, and prepare for a counterstroke. But war, especially in the Balkans, had a way of devouring simplicity. A British liaison officer stationed on the ridge nearby later recalled watching the columns snake down the valley. He wrote, "The Frenchmen moved in ranks as steady as a stream of iron, and then they were gone. One by one the line was swallowed whole, until only the mist remained. I expected the head of the column to emerge on the other side. They never did." The officer waited. 10 minutes, 30 an hour, still no sound of marching boots, no clink of rifles against canteens, no shouted orders. The French were simply gone. When the fog lifted the next morning, the path lay empty. No corpses, no shell craters, no discarded packs. Hundreds of men, armed, disciplined, ready for battle, had disappeared without leaving a trace. The official record, buried in French reports, reduced it to a sterile phrase: unexplained absence of forces. But the soldiers who served in Macedonia whispered of it for years afterward. Some said the battalion had been taken prisoner, swallowed by Bulgarians in the night. Others swore it had deserted, slipping away into the hills. But the strangest stories were the ones passed in the trenches, of lights in the fog, of men who vanished mid-step, of silence so deep it seemed otherworldly. This is the mystery of the battalion that disappeared before the battle even began. And tonight we're going to pull apart that mystery, because here's the truth: armies don't just vanish. Not entire battalions, not in the middle of a war zone. And yet, this one did. So the question is, what really happened in the Macedonian hills in 1915? When people think of the First World War, their minds jump to the mud and trenches of Flanders, the endless artillery on the Somme, or the bloody stalemate at Verdun. But far from the Western Front, another theater of war unfolded. Less known, less understood, but no less brutal: the Balkans. In 1914, Serbia had been the spark that lit the powder keg of Europe. By late 1915, that small kingdom was fighting for its very life. The combined weight of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Bulgaria pressed against it. Outnumbered, exhausted, ravaged by disease, the Serbian army retreated across mountains and rivers in a desperate bid to survive. The Allies, Britain and France, decided to intervene. They landed troops at Salonika, a Greek port city, with hopes of creating a new front that would relieve pressure on Serbia and pin down the Bulgarians. But the campaign quickly turned into what soldiers mockingly called the Gardeners of Salonika. Troops were bogged down not in trenches, but in marshes. Mosquitoes replaced machine guns as the deadliest enemy. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion carved through Allied ranks. Still, the Allied command pushed forward. By October 1915, reinforcements were moving north, climbing through mountain passes, threading narrow goat paths that twisted between ravines. The terrain was like nothing soldiers had seen on the Western Front. No flat no man's land. Instead, walls of rock, dense forests and valleys drowned in fog. It was into this world that the 57th French Colonial Infantry Battalion marched. This unit was a composite force, drawn from the far corners of France's empire. There were men from Algeria and Senegal, hardened veterans of colonial campaigns. There were Frenchmen from Provence and Brittany, shipped across Europe into a land that felt utterly foreign. Their uniforms bore the dust of Africa and the mud of France. Their officers carried a reputation for toughness. These were not green recruits, but men who had seen war in more than one climate. And yet, the Salonika front tested them in ways they hadn't imagined. The supply lines were fragile. Horses collapsed under the weight of artillery, dragged up mountain paths. Rations arrived spoiled after weeks on the move. Ammunition stocks were unreliable, and disease, always disease, stalked the camps. One British doctor wrote bitterly, "I bury more men by the shovel than the bullet," but the mission remained. French command insisted on linking up with what remained of the Serbian army. For that, battalions like the 57th were dispatched deep into the Macedonian countryside, marching blind into mountains where enemy patrols could be anywhere or nowhere. The fog was a constant, not the soft mist of a spring morning, but a dense, choking white curtain. Soldiers joked grimly that it could hide entire armies. Sometimes they weren't joking. Patrols vanished for days. Units became lost within hours. Maps were useless. Compasses unreliable in the jagged ridges. One French lieutenant recorded in his journal, "We march by sound, not sight." The rattle of mess tins, the cough of a mule, the shuffle of boots in mud. That is how you know the man beside you is still there. In the fog, he can disappear in an instant. This was the world of October 1915, the stage on which the disappearance would occur. An army spread thin, fighting not just the Bulgarians, but terrain, disease, and confusion. A campaign overshadowed by greater battles elsewhere, left to rot in obscurity. And within that obscurity, one battalion stepped into fog and never returned. What made this incident so unsettling was not just the loss of men, but the context. On the Western Front, a battalion could be wiped out in minutes by artillery, and the world would know exactly how and why. On the Salonika front, nothing made sense. A battalion could march into mist and leave behind only questions, and for the French command, those questions had no easy answers. If the men had deserted, why were no stragglers ever found? If they had been ambushed, where were the bodies? If they had been captured, why were there no prisoner reports? The disappearance of the 57th didn't just deepen the fog of war. It became a fog of history. October 1915. The orders were clear. The 57th French Colonial Infantry Battalion was to advance through the Macedonian hills, link with Serbian forces retreating under Bulgarian pressure, and secure a route for Allied reinforcements. The battalion, nearly 1,000 men strong, assembled before dusk. Packs were tightened, rifles inspected, bayonets fixed. Officers checked their compasses and maps, though everyone knew they would be useless once the fog came down. A bugler sounded softly and the column began to move. The first hour of the march was uneventful. The soldiers trudged in silence, boots grinding against gravel and dirt. The air grew colder, wetter, heavy with the smell of pine and damp stone. Lanterns flickered, their weak glow unable to penetrate more than a few feet ahead. The fog thickened until the men could barely see the silhouette of the soldier in front of them. One corporal later described it in his diary. The fog was alive. It pressed against your face, crawled into your lungs, and swallowed your words. I walked with my hand on the man's pack before me. If I let go, I was alone in the world. The path wound along a narrow ridge. To the left, a steep drop vanished into nothingness. To the right, jagged rock walls rose like fortress battlements. The men kept formation as best they could, their movements ghostly in the mist. From a distance, observers could see the columns snaking into the white curtain. A British liaison officer, stationed on a hillside, later testified that he watched the French line vanish section by section. He expected to see the vanguard emerge further along the ridge. They never did. Back in the marching column, the disappearance unfolded more slowly, more insidiously. A squad near the rear recalled hearing a shouted order up ahead. Then silence. The sound of boots faded. When the men pushed forward to catch up, they found only emptiness. The road stretched on, swallowed in fog, but the comrades who had marched just moments before were gone. Some soldiers reported strange lights, faint, bluish glows flickering in the mist, moving against the wind. Others swore they heard muffled cries like voices underwater. A few admitted that panic set in. Men clutched their rifles tighter, certain an ambush was imminent. Yet no shots were fired, no steel met steel. Just silence. By dawn, the rear elements of the battalion halted, realizing they were alone. The officers regrouped what men they had and sent scouts forward. Those scouts returned with nothing. No trace of the lead companies, no bodies, no weapons, no packs. The path was bare, as if the ground itself had swallowed hundreds of men. When the fog lifted fully, the scale of the mystery became clear. The air force, nearly 1,000 strong, had dissolved into thin air. Panic rippled through the Allied camp. At first, the explanation seemed simple. Ambush. The Bulgarians, who knew the terrain intimately, could have descended in the fog, captured the Frenchmen and dragged them into hidden valleys. But searches revealed no signs of struggle, no spent shells, no broken equipment, not even a single bloodstain. The second explanation was desertion. Some officers suggested the men, weary of disease and hunger, had melted into the hills or even defected. But again, the evidence failed. No deserters appeared in nearby villages. No Bulgarians reported a wave of French captives switching sides. Desertion leaves stragglers, loners, groups that splinter away. Here it was everyone or no one, and so the rumors began. Soldiers whispered that the fog itself had taken them, that the land was cursed, that Macedonia's mountains swallowed armies whole. Superstition thrives in silence, and the Salonika front was silent enough to breed plenty of it. One rumor claimed the battalion had marched straight into a ravine, the fog hiding the edge until it was too late. But searches of the valleys below found nothing. Another suggested they had been spirited away, an old Balkan tale of the white mist that carries souls. Even British soldiers, usually dismissive of local legends, recorded in letters home that something unnatural had happened that night. French command faced a dilemma. They could not allow word to spread that an entire battalion had vanished without explanation. It would destroy morale on a front already riddled with disease and despair. And so the incident was buried in vague official phrasing. Unexplained absence of forces. The files moved quietly into archives. Never publicized, never explained. But among the rank and file, the story spread. Soldiers in trenches across Macedonia spoke of the Battalion Fantôme, the Phantom Battalion. Some swore that on misty nights they heard marching boots echoing faintly in the distance, as if the lost men still walked the ridges, forever caught in the fog. The disappearance became less a military puzzle and more a haunting legend. And like all legends, it left behind more questions than answers. The disappearance of the 57th was more than a tactical problem. It was a wound to the psyche of an already fragile army. On the Salonika front, morale was always thin. Soldiers fought less against enemy bullets and more against boredom, disease, and despair. Entire camps were crippled by malaria. Rations arrived spoiled or half empty. Letters from home describe battles in France where men died by the tens of thousands. Compared to Verdun or the Somme, the Macedonian campaign seemed forgotten, almost meaningless. Now word spread that a battalion had been swallowed whole. For commanders, the practical loss mattered first. 1,000 trained men could not easily be replaced on a front already short of manpower. Reports were filed, search parties dispatched, prisoner records scoured. Nothing. The Bulgarians, who surely would have boasted of such a capture, remained silent. Local villagers, questioned harshly, had nothing to offer. The disappearance left no trail to follow, but the psychological cost was worse. In every trench, whispers began, "If the fog can take them, it can take us." Some men grew restless, refusing to march at night unless escorted by larger formations. Others carried extra ammunition, convinced the battalion had been ambushed by invisible foes. A few became openly superstitious, tying charms to rifles, scribbling prayers on scraps of paper, muttering about ghosts. A British officer wrote home, "The Frenchmen are rattled. They glance over their shoulders at every mist." Even our Tommies, usually contemptuous of such talk, now speak in low tones when the fog rises. Something here frightens them. The French High Command realized the danger. In war, fear is as contagious as disease. If soldiers believe the ground itself is cursed, discipline unravels. And so the official story was carefully constructed. The battalion, they claimed, had been lost in confusion, absorbed into another unit, miscounted in the chaos of the retreat. No mystery, no ghosts, just the usual fog of war. But soldiers are not fools. They knew when they were being managed. The official explanation only deepened suspicion. Men who had marched behind the 57th swore the disappearance was real. Officers who had seen the fog swallow the column could not reconcile their eyes with the paperwork. And so the story spread. From campfires to trenches, from Macedonia to France, rumors grew. The Phantom Battalion became a warning, a symbol of the front's strangeness. Unlike the predictable slaughter of the Western Front, here men could vanish without a trace. The disappearance also had strategic consequences. French commanders hesitated to commit further troops deep into the Macedonian mountains. Patrols were reduced. Marches were rescheduled to daylight when possible. Some argued this caution slowed operations and ceded initiative to the Bulgarians. Others believed it prevented panic from spiraling into collapse. Back in Paris, the incident was buried. France could not afford stories of vanishing armies when public morale already strained under the weight of Verdun. Official communiques from Salonika reported steady progress and firm Allied resolve. The missing battalion was reduced to a line of numbers in casualty reports. Its fate left officially uncertain, but among the soldiers themselves the legend endured. Men wrote in letters home about comrades who had marched into the mist and never returned. These letters, censored heavily, still carried hints that reached French villages, where families whispered of dark omens in Macedonia. For the Allies, it became a cautionary tale, an example of the front's unpredictability. For the men who lived it, it was far worse. Imagine watching the man beside you vanish step by step, or hearing marching boots ahead that never lead anywhere. Imagine reporting it to your superior and being told to carry on, as if nothing had happened. The battalion's absence created not just a gap in the order of battle, but a permanent scar in the imagination of those who survived the Salonika campaign. It reminded them that in war the enemy was not always a man with a rifle. Sometimes it was silence, sometimes it was the unknown, and that unknown, once unleashed, could not be contained by paperwork or propaganda. In war, death is expected. Soldiers brace themselves for artillery, machine guns, hunger, and disease. But disappearance, utter vanishing, that is something else entirely. It is the kind of story that unsettles even hardened veterans because it cuts against the rhythm of war. You fight, you fall, you die, you are buried. The battlefield keeps its evidence. The 57th French Colonial Infantry Battalion left no evidence, so what happened? Historians have debated for more than a century, but answers remain elusive. The most conventional explanation is capture. The Bulgarians knew the terrain, had patrols in the area, and might have seized the battalion under cover of fog. But there is a problem. No records exist of such a mass capture. Prisoner lists, often meticulously kept, contain no mention of hundreds of Frenchmen seized in one night. Even Bulgarian memoirs, so quick to boast of victories elsewhere, remain silent. Another theory is misplacement. The Salonika front was notorious for chaos. Units were shuffled, renamed, attached and detached until identities blurred. Perhaps the 57th was simply absorbed into another regiment, its records lost in the bureaucracy of war. Yet this too rings hollow. Soldiers remember who they served beside. Survivors from neighboring units swore that the men of the 57th did not reappear under another banner. And then there is desertion. War-worn, ill-fed, sick with malaria, some argue the battalion melted into the countryside. But desertion happens in fragments, not en masse. Individuals slip away. Groups scatter. To have nearly an entire battalion vanish together, without any trace, without even a rumor of them joining villages or bandit groups, strains belief. Finally, there is the legend that the fog itself consumed them, that strange lights led them astray, that Macedonia's hills are haunted, swallowing armies as the land itself takes revenge for centuries of war. It is a superstition, of course, but one that soldiers clung to because sometimes myth feels truer than paperwork. The truth may never be known. Perhaps the answer lies buried in some forgotten archive, a misfiled report of men taken prisoner and marched into obscurity. Or perhaps it lies in an unmarked mass grave on a Macedonian hillside where bones still wait for discovery. Until then, the 57th remain what they became in 1915, a ghost battalion. But here's the larger question. Why does this story still matter? Why should we remember a disappearance on a forgotten front of a century-old war? Because it captures something essential about the nature of conflict. War is not neat columns on a map, nor tidy casualty reports. It is confusion. It is fog, literal and metaphorical. Orders vanish in transmission. Men vanish in chaos. Truth vanishes in rumor. The disappearance of the 57th is not just a mystery. It is a symbol of the larger truth, that in war certainty is the first casualty. It also reminds us of the human cost of obscurity. These men were real. They had names, families, letters tucked in their packs. They were sons of Algeria, Senegal, France. They marched into the mist believing they would fight, perhaps die, but at least be remembered. Instead, they slipped into anonymity. Their sacrifice was not glorious. It was not even recorded properly. It was forgotten. And yet in that forgetting, a strange kind of immortality was born. The Phantom Battalion became a legend retold in trenches, whispered in villages, and passed down by historians trying to make sense of it. Their absence became their presence. Their silence became their story. War has always produced mysteries like this. At Gallipoli, the 1/5th Norfolk supposedly marched into mist and never returned, a tale that still divides historians. On the Eastern Front, entire divisions were swallowed by the Russian steppe, never accounted for. And in every war since, families have waited for sons who never came home, lost in files marked missing. The difference here is scale and the eerie perfection of the vanishing. An entire battalion, gone before battle even began. As the fog lifted on that Macedonian morning in 1915, the empty road must have chilled the searchers more than any artillery barrage. At least with shells and shrapnel, you know where the men went. Here the silence told them nothing, and maybe that is why the story endures. Because deep down, the thought of vanishing is more terrifying than the thought of dying. Death has rituals, graves, prayers, names carved into stone. Vanishing leaves only questions, and questions linger. So when we speak of the battalion that disappeared before the battle began, we are not just recalling a curious footnote of World War I. We are confronting the larger reality of human conflict, that war erases not only lives, but certainty, memory, and sometimes even truth itself. The fog of war is not just a metaphor. In Macedonia in 1915, it was real. It swallowed men whole, and it left behind a silence that still echoes more than a century later. A fighting force erased without a trace, their names fading into the fog of history. Were they betrayed, cursed, or simply forgotten? If you believe stories like this must be remembered, subscribe. Leave your thoughts below and share this so their memory doesn't die in silence. Because history is not only what happened, it's what we refuse to forget.